a scruffy man meekly shouting his name while sweating profusely. This is our introduction to Yamashita Kazuo. If I were to use a word to describe him, it would be this one: inconsequential. You might wonder why I've decided to analyze him instead of one of the many specimens of alpha males that make Kenken Ashura the testosterone-fueled story that it is. The reason is actually quite simple. Kazuo is a realistic depiction of the modern male, making him more relatable in both his attitude and struggles. He has all of the markings of someone who let society erode his personality and virtue. In short, a beta male. Whether you like it or not, you are also impacted by this corrosion of values, as many of your flaws are actually just symptoms of our times, with Yamashita being their culmination. Just like many people, he is polite, not because he understands the importance of cordial social interactions, but simply out of cowardice. He hates confrontation so much that he does anything he can to never appear aggressive. He is terrified of violence, and is incapable of being around masculine men, as their energy is the exact antithesis to his pathetic existence. And yet, he desires that trait, as he recognizes that it is the missing link that would turn his life around. He fantasizes about brutalizing dudes that have power over him, showing that he isn't really opposed to using his fists to earn their respect. He just doesn't have the balls to go through with it. His dreams of self-sufficiency will never materialize, not because he doesn't have the potential to defend himself, but because he hides his passivity behind empty moral tenets that make him feel better about being a doormat. If I don't fight back when I'm attacked, it's because the government forbids it. This is the type of lies that beta males tell themselves. And just like Yamashita, we are all guilty of this debased behavior. His story is our story, and his journey an allegory of our own. So let us walk together at his side as he sheds this pathetic envelope to reveal the man that he was always meant to be. Kazuo is a 56-year-old salaryman who has been working for the same company ever since he entered the workforce. He has never received any major promotions. His house is messy and overcrowded, a representation of his unorganized existence. His wife left him for a motive he ignores. He feels no anger towards her. Rather, he is resigned to it. His sense of self-worth is so low that he does not perceive this as a potential slight against him. Instead, he thinks he deserves it, or worse, that he never deserved her. Ironically, it is likely that his pitiful mindset is the reason why his wife left in the first place. But he is incapable of realizing that, too busy that he is feeling sorry for himself. He lives in an overpriced house on a land that he feels no attachment towards. But he still pays a monthly mortgage for it, because this is the way society told him to lead his life. As a result, the bank owns both his home and him, and he is forced to work extra hours at a job he hates with superiors that show him no consideration to be able to survive. To cope with this meaningless existence, he has convinced himself that this is the standard that everyone deals with, effectively normalizing his misery and settling in his own cognitive dissonance. However, the look on his face betrays his true feelings. He hates his life and wishes he could do away with his victim status, but he's too much of a coward to go against the grain. In this respect, we are all like him. We do things because everyone else does, something we justify by calling it common sense. Kazuo would not be able to use this crutch for long, however. His meeting with Tokita Oma, whom he differs from in every aspect, would serve as the catalyst that forced him to face his inadequacies, and realized that his adherence to the norm was nothing but a defense mechanism to protect himself from the reality of his situation. That of a pitiful ersatz of a man who hides himself behind social conventions to justify never standing up for himself. For some, this ego death would spell disaster. But in Kazuo's case, it is the start of his renaissance. I have already covered Tokita Oma in a video you can find in the description. If you haven't seen it yet, I recommend you check it out. But in truth, the only thing you need to know is this. Oma is the quintessential alpha male. And as such, he stands in opposition to Yamashita. His meeting with this antagonistic force was a real shock. So much so that he became numb to interactions that would have previously scared him by their intensity. Kazuo is afraid of his own death, something that had always led him to act submissively in hopes to be less of a target. A behavior that has instead a tendency of attracting abusers. But after being offered a fight by the manliest individual he had ever met, and experiencing the fear that precedes a near-death experience, his threshold for conflict was greatly increased. Making threats by his manager or random thugs appear totally incidental in his eyes. He's not brave yet, but he's not a coward either. At this point, he is a blank slate. His sensitivity to aggression is gone, but he still doesn't have what it takes to fight back. That is, when he is the one being threatened. Because Oma was the one to instill the fear of God into him, he also became his mentor. As such, Yamashita's identity became entangled with his, meaning that anyone doubting his new role model is also incidentally critiquing him. And if Kazuo doesn't have the balls to fight for his own sake, he seems to find the courage to strike back when time comes to protect his idol. This is an incredibly common behavior amongst betas. They only show their teeth in indirect conflicts, because they unconsciously perceive that there is no risk associated with a confrontation that doesn't concern them directly. It serves as a passive-aggressive way to protect one's own values by hiding behind the figure of a protector, all the while pretending to defend them. This hypocritical act immediately falls apart when the beta is confronted face to face. Something that Yamashita experienced when he got strong-armed into contracting debt and joining an organization against his will. Now that he has to stand on his own two legs, all of this newfound fire is gone, which is par for the course. When faced with an alpha, the beta crumbles. Not because he was born inferior, or because he is physically weaker, but because he has no agency. The reason why Yamashita isn't able to stand up to his boss isn't because there is a power imbalance between the two, but because he allows himself to be subjugated by what he perceives to be an unavoidable hierarchical domination. Nothing is stopping you from telling your manager to shove it, but you're too afraid of losing your job, leading you to accept humiliations and mistreatments. This isn't just happening at your workplace. You're continuously letting societal pressure get to you, leading to others making decisions for you. Just like Kazuo was bullied into taking a decision that he was opposed to because of his fear of unemployment. It is our adherence to norms that opens us up to being abused by the system they constitute, making conformism a powerful tool of self-curing. We become victims of a society that has us convinced that following rules which limit our freedom will eventually get us everything we ever wanted, which is a lie. All it does is turn us into slaves that have lost their ability to live without a system they never needed in the first place. From a pragmatical standpoint, Kazuo is lucky in that he was able to witness firsthand how his status as a dependent could lead to him losing his agency to the type of nanny states that are so present in our lives. A lot of us never realize that we are being owned by a government or organization that doesn't have our best interest in mind. until it is too late. As such, entering the Kengan Association was an eye-opener for him. For the first time in his life, he was surrounded by people who he was objectively inferior to in every aspect. The first step to stop being a beta is to realize that you are one, and the best way to do that is to be forced to interact with alphas. The tournament also served the purpose of showing to Kazuo exactly how little control he actually has on his life, as he was constantly forced to deal with unforeseen situations he hadn't entered willingly, leading to last-second improvisations. This forced him to confront the type of pressure he had always submitted to or dodged in the past, taking him out of his comfort zone and removing the doubts that have always prevented him from living in the instant. And if from his perspective, Yamashita felt a complete lack of control, those with an external viewpoint on the situation all had the impression that he was a very capable and competent businessman. This is because we all exist inside our own head, making self-perception and social status distinct values, and contradicting the idea that people are born either alpha or beta. In truth, no one is anything. We only act as such. Therefore, the easiest way for anyone to change their identity is simply to start acting the way they want to be perceived. Since Kazuo was tossed in an unknown environment, he couldn't fall back onto his old habits, leading his perceived hierarchical status to skyrocket. Always remember this: power lies where we think it lies. If class mobility is a thing, then status mobility surely is as well. For a lot of low-status men, the issue is that they either choose to ignore the existence of hierarchical structures or have convinced themselves that their unfortunate position is the result of their birth or an environment they cannot control, a misconception they feed via their passivity. Since they refuse to do anything to change, they never do, reinforcing their beliefs that they will be low status for life, and that it isn't their fault. Kazuo doesn't have a choice. He's been plunged into a life or death scenario where inactivity isn't an option. His fear of financial demise, which had shackled him to his mediocre job in the past, is now serving as motivation fuel to extirpate himself from a situation that this very same occupation has led him into in the first place. Betas are characterized by an aversion for action and often suffer from boiling frog syndrome. Their misery never becomes severe enough to motivate an escape, while still remaining a constant in their lives that entirely prevents them from being happy. The only way to leave the pot is to either realize that the temperature of the water is slowly rising, which is almost impossible, or to get tossed directly into the inferno without time to get used to it first. Yamashita is experiencing the second scenario. He suddenly got plunged into an environment in which his only alternative would be to fight, and so he did. This is in stark contradiction with his past life, where the closest he ever got to conflict was watching UFC matches on TV. This links directly to another misconception about low-status men. Their problem isn't that they come out worse during confrontations or even lose, but that they shy away from them altogether. Spending hours every day watching sports, but never practicing any, is a byproduct of this avoidance strategy, which indirectly comforts the beta in his passivity, as the action of watching other men be physical becomes enough for them to feel fulfilled. Case in point, watching sports is considered a manly activity, an inversion of values that has slowly led to the emasculation of the modern man. Spending hours sitting on a couch, following a sport, but never practicing it or being active is both pathetically weak and incomprehensibly stupid. This tournament by throwing Yamashita in the midst of turmoil, solved that problem entirely. Now, he is free to suffer from the spirit-crushing anxiety of having to fight for his life, a thought he had always managed to divert himself from. A beta isn't born, he is made. And there isn't a better nursing ground for weaklings than our modern world, what with all of the distractions that it offers. Every time you think of changing your ways, you'll have another easier and more pleasurable option available instead. Feeling awkward in public? Look at your phone. Feeling bored? Eat sugary food. Feeling depressed? Jerk off. That'll make you feel better. The unforgiving environment of the Kengen Association bars all of these escape routes and forces Kazuo to take a good hard look at himself. If Oma is his guardian angel, then the tournament is his personal hell. It is the microcosmic representation of all the accumulated struggles he had refused to face in his lifespan or was facing at once. The most crucial being his relationship with his son Kenzo. At the heart of every broken man is a wound that never healed. And for Yamashita, this gash was inflicted by his failure to be a good father to his firstborn. On my first read of the series, I had found the introduction of a family drama in the middle of what is essentially a succession of fighting sequences to be quite a peculiar addition. After analysis, I realized that it actually made total sense, because Kengen Ashura isn't a pure martial arts series. Rather, I believe it to be a tale of self-improvement, and one entirely based around the characters of Oma and Yamashita. If the fighter seeks to make peace with his anger and develops a more stoic approach to life as the story goes on, the salaryman is struggling to regain control of his agency, sharpening his aggressivity and using it to confront the ghosts of his past. His principal hurdle is materialized under the traits of Kure Ryan, a professional assassin that on paper should have absolutely nothing to do with Yamashita, but who ends up being the trigger of his transformation. He enjoys torturing people, and never misses a chance to remind other men of their inferiority compared to him, a quirk that some would consider to be an alpha trait, as it is a way to establish dominance within social settings. And in a sense, they're not wrong. There will often be some level or another of banter between males of the same group, which often serves to camouflage actual power struggles. For men, these constitute occasions to reaffirm their position within the hierarchy, either by bullying a subordinate or taking shots at a higher-ranking member, and tend to be regarded as harmless fun. But for a beta who's given up on the idea of affirming himself, these verbal interactions are perceived as painful bullying sessions, existing solely for the purpose of humiliating him. This is exactly what happened to Yamashita, who simply could not handle hearing someone insult his son Kenzo, which then forced him to confront his own contradictions, considering he hadn't seen or spoken to him in the past 10 years, despite the two living underneath the same roof. Worse, he had started to develop actual hatred towards his own blood, as the resentment of having to house and feed someone who appeared to do nothing of his days made him resentful. Ryan immediately sensed that weakness, as predators usually do, and immediately used it to push Kazuo into a mental breakdown. This is what happens when you lie to yourself for years. The second someone is able to see through you and exposes your true colors, you crack. It was because he was so afraid to face his demons that Yamashita ended up eventually getting devoured by them. Betas often try to convince themselves and others that there is nothing malevolent about them, thinking that it makes them appear virtuous. Not only does that not work, but it also takes away from their ability to better themselves, as they are pretending that the very flaws that make them miserable don't exist. In Yamashita's case, it was his relationship with his son, a boy that had always made him proud and who showed a lot of promise, so much so that his intellect eventually led to him manufacturing miniature versions of a human brain in his bedroom. An actual scientific tour de force that made Kazuo believe his offspring was a monster. Regardless of how impressive this achievement is, what struck him first was that his son broke a taboo. He went against society's conventions. In that aspect, he was scary because he had broken free from the norm. Not long after, Kenzo would isolate himself entirely from the rest of the family. A relief for Yamashita, who simply could not face the demon he thought his boy had become. The day where he shrunk in fear in front of him would be his last contact with his son, and for 10 years, he had done his best to never think about it. The reason why he buried this memory is because he knew deep down that by allowing his son to become a shut-in, he had essentially given up on him. As a patriarch, he should have either congratulated him for his success or admonished him for his transgression. Avoidance was the only wrong route to take, but it was also the easiest. And so he took it, guided by cowardice. With time, this self-inflicted wound got infected, leading to him transferring all of his guilt onto Kenzo, as it was less painful than accepting the fact that he was responsible for this situation. You should notice a pattern here. A beta always takes the easy way out. You can run away from difficult decisions as much as you want. They always find a way to catch up to you. And when they do, the negative emotions they carry with them are of an entirely different caliber, because you allow them to snowball uncontrolled. Ryan simply took that reality and shoved it into Kazuo's face. Once the dam the father had built in his heart broke, all his distress came pouring out. He finally accepted his responsibility in the fate of his son, leaving behind all semblance of dignity and begging Oma to save him. You might see this expression of passivity and think of it as a beta move. And you would be correct if it weren't for one thing. Low-status men have a tendency to meticulously craft social masks that they then use to disguise their weakness, never allowing anyone to touch the true essence of who they are. Tearing down that mask is a sign of acceptation, the first necessary step that allows oneself to walk on what is underneath, which is what Kazuo did. Also, keep in mind one thing. Oma is his role model, not just in practice, but also on a spiritual level. As I've explained, this tournament functions as a purgatory of sorts, forcing Yamashita to face all of the mistakes he accumulated in his life. As such, the people that populate this underworld are all allegorical manifestations of his struggles. Kenzo is the innovative and rebellious spirit that he keeps locked away. Ryan is the negative but honest side of him, which he refuses to listen. And Oma is the courageous and confident representation of who he wishes he could be. By asking him to win for his son, he is both recognizing his faults and entering the fight himself. This theory is immediately verified by his complete change of attitude towards conflict that follows the decision to retake his rightful spot as Kenzo's father. By accepting responsibility for his past mistakes, he freed himself from the weight of a culpability that prevented him from being a good man. Remember what I told you about betas. They only show aggression when they can hide behind a proxy. In this case, it is the exact opposite. Yamashita is positioning himself between adversity and those he wishes to save, and by doing so, he has regained his agency. If you're not willing to die for your family, then you won't be willing to die for anything. That much is certain. He needed something to protect, something so valuable that it would make him forget that he was risking his life in the process. That something was his sons. The first is Kazuo, whom he thought he had lost. And the second is Oma, the one he adopted, the one that adopted him, who came into his life like a tornado and annihilated it all for the better. Yamashita and Oma, the alpha and the beta, the yin and the yang, the passive and the active. What were the chances that these two men would grow fond of one another, united that they were by a fate that had brought the two antipodes together? Opposites attract because they complete one another. Tokita brought back the fire that had deserted the salaryman's life, and in turn, he became his guiding light, a beacon in a world that had only known darkness. This would make Kazuo's last challenge that much more difficult: to let go of his role model. So far, he was still using training wheels. Once they're off, it could be tempting to fall back on old habits and turn away from reality. In a word, to cope, pretending that the problem doesn't exist. Making a change might seem hard, but the real difficulties begin when it is time to sustain that evolution without the use of crutches. Oma's death would signify the disappearance of the support system that had allowed Yamashita to change. Considering its importance, it is natural that he would do everything in his power to prevent that from happening. This shows one thing: his transformation is not complete yet. After all this work and all these challenges, he is still a dependent. When his hero is not there to guide him, he immediately regresses back into the pathetic beta that he always was. The only thing that can get him back to his senses is the mention of someone else's welfare, proving that he has not yet learned to value himself at the same level that he values others. Some would call it selflessness. I personally find it stupid, since this mindset often leads to accumulating resentment that then prevents you from being useful to others. Kazuo has yet to integrate this factor, and by preventing Oma from fighting, it is actually his own way of life that he is trying to protect, showing that he is incapable of sustaining his progress without help. A beta would try to root this behavior in virtue. After all, getting in the way of someone who is heading for their death is good, right? Well, it is, but only if your intentions are untainted by self-interest. Yamashita is past that point. He perfectly accepts and recognizes that the reason he doesn't want to see Oma go is because he cannot continue without him. He gives all the credit of his transformation to his benefactor, committing the classic mistake of not developing ownership. In doing so, he prevents his true self from reaching its final form, and keeps himself in a state of arrested development. On a symbolical level, he also expresses his lingering fear of death, that he only manages to surmount when someone else's life is at stake. We dread the impact that the passing of our loved ones will have on us, the more sinister of which being the way it makes us reflect on our own mortality. If Oma dies, a part of him will die, and he is deeply afraid of that. If Kazuo needs to learn to let go, it isn't just of his friend, but also of his fear. The fear that has led him to accept toiling away at a shitty job to pay out the ass for a shitty house while becoming a shitty dad that would eventually devolve into being a shitty man. Oma is not the type of man to let someone else dictate his behavior. Forcing Yamashita to live with the idea that if he now has the ability to be the captain of his own life, the agencies of others will forever remain outside of his control. Seeking to coerce others into acting the way you want them to, and forcing them to believe only in what you deem appropriate, is the behavior of subhumans. A true alpha contents himself with controlling his own thoughts and actions. A life lesson that Kazuo had to go through the 5 stages of grief to discover, eventually reaching acceptance and liberating himself from past limitations. At this point, his metamorphosis is almost complete. The last thing required for him to spread his wings is to see that the last wishes of his friend are respected. To do so, he has to face his boss, a man he was previously terrified of, and who managed to talk him into contracting 5 billion in debt to enter the tournament. But the Kazuo that would let others push him around is no more, and when faced with what constitutes a clear order, conscious that such an answer would invite conflict, he simply says no. Yes and no are the 2 most confident words that one can utter, because they are absolute. When you use them, you make it known that you have the power to take firm decisions, expressing your individuality in the meanwhile. Truly, there are no lexical terms more alpha than these 2. This is reinforced by the fact that deep down, Yamashita does not want Oma to fight, but he recognizes that pulling him out of the tournament would be the easy way out, and is not about to fall into the same trap that has sabotaged his life before. He made his decision, and he is sticking to it. No amount of pleading can change that. Even when faced with the possibility of erasing his debt, recovering his job, and saving Oma, he stands firm. All of these offers are playing off of his fears, and accepting them would be succumbing to his demons. Even a proposition as juicy as a spot of CEO of the largest company in the country, along with unlimited executive power, isn't enough to make him budge. Instead of letting his stressful situation reduce him to the man he used to be, Kazuo instead uses it as an opportunity to practice rightfulness. He passed the test. There is only one thing left for him to do: watch his friend die.